Hey there. Good morning to you. Glad you're here today. Today, I'm going to be talking about how do you store and organize your miniatures for your Santray collection, and does it even matter? Um, so I'm Kathy Spooner. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a registered play therapist supervisor here in the United States with almost 30 years experience in the mental health field, working with children, adolescents, and families. And today I'm going to talk about Santray miniatures and using Santray miniatures in your clinical work, as it specifically relates to how do you store them, how do you organize them. When I conduct Santray trainings for mental health professionals, I get asked this question all the time. And the question I get asked really is, does it matter how I store them? And my typical response is, yes, it definitely matters. And there's the ideal, and then there's the practical. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about both, and maintaining your miniatures, keeping them organized, and storing them. So first and foremost is, I think it's really important to have your miniature collection organized into categories. You can see behind me, I have my Santray miniatures. You can see I have the trees all together. I have the bridges and fences and those kinds of things. And then I'll have houses together. I try to keep more of the natural elements together, so to speak. Natural elements, meaning trees, flowers, and rocks and stones and things like that. I try to keep those together. The reason I think it's important to keep them organized is so that you have them in categories that are therapeutic in nature. And typically you want to make sure that you're choosing miniatures for your collection based on their therapeutic value. So having conflict type figures, like I call them fighting figures, like armies, or like in the pioneer days, there were the cowboys and Indians. On the East Coast, there are the revolutionary figures. There's the Civil War figures. So the fighting figures kind of allow some of those aggressive emotions to be played out, conflict, things like that. Having like trees in nature, having houses, having animals, different categories of animals. So you want to put them in, arrange them in an organized way on your shelving. And you want to make sure that the miniatures go back to the same place every time. And the reason for that is your clients are going to get to know your miniatures and where they are on your shelf. So you want to make sure they're in the same place every time, because the theory model is that your unconscious is going to be drawn towards the miniatures that are needed in that moment to work through whatever mental health challenge is going on. And so from week to week, your client is going to come week to week, and they're going to know where your miniatures are. And you're going to notice that they're likely to use the same type of miniatures over and over. There may be a little bit of variance with that, which is always noteworthy. The perfect example I like to give here is I was working with I think he was 7, a little 7-year-old boy, and he liked to use the Star Wars miniatures, and he really liked Yoda. He came in one week, and Yoda was not where Yoda normally is. We looked all over my shelving to find Yoda, and for some reason Yoda disappeared. And every week he would come in and want to know, did you find Yoda? And it took me a long time. Yoda got misplaced. Somehow Yoda ended up in another place in the playroom. I think it was like 6 weeks. Seemed like a really long time that it took for Yoda to reemerge. I actually thought Yoda had gotten taken. And I was happy when I realized Yoda hadn't gotten taken. So your clients are going to come in and they're going to know where those symbols are on your shelves. And if you're interested, I have a free PDF, must-have sand tray miniatures for your collection. So it's got all the categories in there and some examples of different types of miniatures you can get in each category. And if you're interested, I will put that in the comments. I'll put a link in the comments after this live episode so you can get that if you want to. So the first thing is making sure your miniatures are organized on your shelves and being intentional about the categories and the types of miniatures that you add to your collection. One of the biggest questions, so that's one of the number one questions I get asked a lot. And the other question I get asked a lot is, does it matter if they stand up or if they're in containers? And you can see behind me from my shelves, I stand them up. I also have some in containers. Like I'll store some in containers. I don't know if you can see these in here, some of the different reptiles. So it's kind of the difference between your eye seeing them this way, if we're thinking about the theory in which your unconscious is going to be drawn towards the miniatures that it needs to use to work through whatever mental health challenge is going on. So seeing them this way versus you can see on the shelf behind me, you can easily see the miniatures. And so the idea is that you'll be naturally drawn towards the miniature that you need to add. And so it's kind of the difference between seeing them on the shelf this way or seeing them all together like that. And as you can see, I have most of mine are standing up, and they're even the trees are organized. I stand them up because I really have found that clients do connect. These are symbols that clients are going to be using to work through whatever challenge, whatever issue that there is going on for them. And the theory is, if given the free and protected space in the therapy office, then our clients will naturally be geared to move towards healing and wholeness. And so if we have that free and protected space and the symbols are readily and easily accessible, then they are able to choose the ones they need to in that moment to work through whatever it is that's going on for them in that moment. Here's the reality, though. So that's the ideal. And then there's what I call reality. Sometimes we don't have a lot of space. And so sometimes we do need to put some in containers. Sometimes if you're a mental health professional and you work in the school, you don't have a dedicated space. Or if you are working in the home, in your client's home, you don't have a dedicated space. So in those situations, you do need to use containers. What I would suggest is make sure your containers are organized. Like you have in one container, you have your army figures. In another container, you have your houses and maybe some bridges. Keep them organized. And then that way, when you set them out, they're still organized into the different kind of categories, and your clients will get to know them in the containers and move towards the ones that they need to use. And if you are using containers, if it's possible, I would try to keep them in smaller ones, because you can see from in here, like this is a small little container. And you can still see them pretty easily, as opposed to if you have like a big giant container, they're going to have to sort through and pick them out. The other thing about standing them up or having them in containers, it really does depend on the theory model that you're using for sand tray. So for instance, if you are using child-centered play therapy and you have a 4-year-old who's working in the sand tray, you're going to use that theory model with the sand tray. So you'll do your tracking, and it's a little bit different, not too much different. For my office previously, in another office, when I had just a dedicated room for child-centered play therapy, because there were so many other toys in there as well, I did have them in containers. I just made sure they were small so they could still see the miniatures in there. I didn't have nearly the miniatures I use, like the ones I have behind. And when I don't have a dedicated playroom and I have more of a dedicated sand tray room, that's the other question I get a lot. Does it matter if the sand tray is in the same room or is the playroom, or do you need a dedicated one? I've done both. Both have their pros and cons. So let me see who's here today. I just want to check in. If you're watching on the live, go ahead and post your name. Let's see who's here today, where you're from, and how do you store, if you're using sand tray with your clients, how do you store your miniatures? What is your best tip? In your experience, do you store them in containers? Do you put them in shelves? Are you in the school system? How does that work? Are you in the home, going into home? How do you store your miniatures to take them in the home? Any tips that you want to share with people about that? So let's hear from you to see who is here. Go ahead and post in the comments and share your thoughts on the subject as well. Also, here's another question I get asked a lot. Do you let your clients put the miniatures back on the shelf? So how do you handle that? If you have your little clients in your office and they've just made their sand world, or they're in the process, and do you let them put the figures back on the shelf? And my answer to that is I do not. And here's the reason why. I want to ensure the shelving is clean and organized. The miniatures are clean. When I use them in the sand tray, they get all sandy. If you have a wet sand tray and they've been using the miniatures in the wet sand tray, then they're really caked with sand on them. So in my office with the sand tray miniatures, my rule is that I put the miniatures back on the shelf. There's a couple of reasons now with COVID. I'll have a little kind of a bin, kind of a big container. And if they're, let's say they're in the process of making their sand tray, and they've changed their mind about a figure, I'll have them put it in the bin, because that way I can make sure they're cleaned off, and I'll usually sanitize them after the session before I put them back on the shelf. If they're sandy and they need to be washed, then I keep a bucket of water handy and I'll clean them off in the bucket. Here's a pro tip, you never want to let your clients clean off sandy figures and sandy hands in the sink, because that little U thing under the sink, the sand will gather down there and it will clog up your sink. So I usually have a bucket of clean water and I'll let them wash off their hands in the bucket. After the session, if the figures are really sandy and dirty, then I'll wash off the miniatures in the bucket and then I'll let them dry. One of the things that I also like to do is like I'll have a small paintbrush, and then that way before I put the figures back on the shelves, I'll clean them off, because your shelving with your sand figures will get really dusty and you'll have to keep cleaning that off. It's really important to make sure you have a clean and organized space for your miniatures, because it communicates the importance of the therapeutic aspect. These aren't just toys, they are symbols and they're therapeutic in nature. So you want to treat them with that respect in your office. One of the other things that I'll do, here's another little pro tip, these little pasta strainers. These are awesome for cleaning out your sand, but also if they put in a ton of little figures, especially the little gemstones, you can scoop them up and get them cleaned off before you put them back on the shelf, or put them in the bin before you put them back on the shelf. So that kind of helps with making things easier to clean up. Here's the other thing, another question that I get asked as far as keeping the miniatures clean and organized. What happens if the miniatures get broken? So here's the thing, when you're developing or you're acquiring miniatures for your collection, you want to think about, are they breakable? And are you okay with them being breakable? Because if they're breakable, the likelihood they're going to get broken is kind of high. The other thing you want to think about is are you willing for that miniature to go missing? Sometimes they get stolen by our little clients, and we don't know where they are. So you have to be willing to kind of let them go. Here we have a comment here from Faucet Therapy. So Marcia says, in a hired room, I have to set up, and at the end of the child and I will tidy up together. I don't use sand tray, but we tell stories with the miniatures. That's pretty cool. And it's harder when you're in a hired room than, yes, I would say that is hard when you're sharing your space with another person. I totally agree, because, okay, full disclosure here, because I've always shared an office for the most part with other therapists. And it's so irritating to me when the miniatures don't get put back in the right place, or they're dusty, or I actually had one therapist I was sharing an office with, and she did an adolescent group in the office that we shared, because she wanted to be able to use my miniature collection with the adolescents in the group. And one of the adolescents stole one of my amazing pewter dragons with a little crystal on it. Oh, so mad. And I had to fight off. This is full disclosure here. I had to fight off wanting to call the mom and have her bring my figure back. But I had to have a chat with myself, because that was me, Kathy, not being therapeutic in nature. I had no proof that the girl took it. She was not my client. And I just, I had to get over myself that for whatever reason, that girl probably took my miniature, and I was never going to get it back. And it was expensive. I think I paid like $25 for it. So you have to think about those things when you have your miniatures. And do you, like Marcia puts them back together, especially if you don't have your own room, you kind of have to manage that, which is a really great point. Judy! Hi, Judy. How are you? It's nice to have you here. Yes. Thank you for joining me. Judy does mindfulness painting. So if you're on LinkedIn and you are interested in doing some mindfulness painting, you should connect with Judy. She does some she was, Judy, are you still doing your mindfulness painting online, or are you mostly in person now, or both? So if you want to post that, and Judy, actually, if you want to put a link in your comment so people can find it, that would be great. So if you're interested, anyone interested in doing some mindfulness painting, connect with Judy. Um, so, so that is it for today. And just as a recap, you want to make sure the toys in your office, just the way you make sure your toys are kept neat and clean and organized in the playroom because of the therapeutic value of the toys, you want to make sure you're doing the same with the Santray miniatures. You want to keep them organized. You want to make sure they're put back in the same place every time so that when your clients come, they'll know exactly where to get them. And I use Santray therapy with children, adolescents, groups, family therapy, even adults. Using Santray with adults, especially adults working through some attachment and some trauma, it is a very powerful modality. I love using Santray with my adult clients, and the same is true for them. They would go back to the same place week after week. Okay, so I have to tell another really funny story. I'm going to out myself here. This to me is why it's so important. If you're going to use Santray therapy, I really think it's important to do your own Santray work and go to the Santray trainings. There was a place where I would go and get my trainings, and I would. So when you do, one of the things I like about the Santray trainings is you can do your own Santrays. It's so powerful. And if you want to find out how powerful it is, do a Santray training. You get a lot of self-care in there as well. Anyways, so I would go to this particular place for training, and I was doing my Santray. And after a while, I didn't even wear makeup to these trainings because I was usually going to be crying it off. Anyway, so I was doing my Santray. I was doing some really heavy work, and there was this miniature that was just so perfect for what I was really, really working through. And I found myself thinking about that Santray miniature all the time. I knew exactly where it was in the which shelf it was, which room it was in, where it was. I knew where that was. I thought about that figure for weeks because it took me a little while to get back to doing another training. And so finally I made it back there, and I went up and I asked the trainer who knew me well at that point. And I was like, where is this figure? Remember it was like this and it was like that. And she knew exactly which figure I was talking about and took me over there. And there it was. The interesting thing was, by the time I got back to the figure, I didn't really need to use it. But these are the same things our clients will be experiencing as well. They're going to know where those figures are on your shelves. So you want to make sure that they are clean and organized. Let me see. There we go. You want to make sure that they're organized into categories and they're therapeutic in nature. And do you stand them up or do you put them in bins? I would say ideally, if you have the ability to store them standing up, then to me that's the preferred way to store them, because your client is going to be drawn to them and they'll be able to use the miniature that they need in that moment. If you don't, then because there's the practical part of it too, like Marsha was saying. If you're sharing an office, then you don't have the ability always to keep them out. So you want to ideally stand them up. And if you need to use containers, I would just try to keep them in smaller ones so it's easier to see and they don't have to go through as many. And then finally, you want to make sure they're clean and organized. Figure out how you want to handle it. Do they put them back on the shelf? Do they not put them back on the shelf? I also don't clean up the sand tray with my client. I let them leave with the image of the sand tray that they created in their mind. And then after they leave, I will put it away. And again, that's based on theory model that you're using. So you want to make sure that they're clean. You want to make sure that they are in the same space where they're supposed to be. You want to make sure you're shelving, like clean off the sand periodically. Make sure you get the sand off your shelf. And that is it for today. Thank you for being here today. It was awesome. Great feedback. If you're interested, I do have a free PDF for must-have sand tray miniatures. I will put a link to that in the comments. So if that's of interest to you, you can download that. Also, I do have some 2 trainings coming up. One training is going to be this Saturday is the first one, getting grounded to really help you get a solid grounding in using sand tray. So if you've never had a sand tray training and you're really interested or you need a refresher, the first one coming up on Saturday, getting grounded in sand tray, using sand tray in play therapy, that one would be a good one to take. Here is information about my website where you can find the trainings on the website. And if you are interested, I have a supervision group and we meet twice a month. And if you need some support with helping to make sure you're using sand tray and you need some help identifying themes and the process with your client, then we do that in the supervision group. It's an online group. We meet 2 Saturdays, the 2nd and 4th Saturday of the month. So feel free to message me, or you can go to my website and check it out, or feel free to message me. All right, so that is it for today, and I will see you next time. Bye for now.